Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 313. This week the questions are taken from guide 388, that's the guide to HMS Neptune of the Dreadnought race era, the Wednesday video on Galveston Naval Park, and the Friday video on shipwrecks and Australia at the Western Australia Shipwreck Museum. So let's start with questions. Ironblood Enjoyer asks, given the only carriers that the Royal Navy had at the time of the Washington Naval Treaty were Argus, Courageous, Glorious, and Furious, plus whatever small seaplane tenders they might have had, could at least one of the G3 class battlecruisers have been converted into an aircraft carrier? Technically speaking, maybe. Practically speaking, probably not. The technical reasons as to why you potentially could have a timeline where this is plausible come down to three things. Firstly, at the time of the Washington Naval Treaty being signed, Argus was a carrier, Furious was part carrier, and Courageous and Glorious were just in reserve. And in the aftermath of the Washington Naval Treaty, that was when the decision was taken to make Courageous and Glorious into full carriers, well, convert them into full carriers, and Furious got the rest of its conversion. And that's because there was a clause in the Washington Naval Treaty that allowed for a limited amount of tonnage that was under construction to be converted into aircraft carriers, or tonnage that you already had in the case of the Courageous class. So you would have to not convert Courageous and Glorious, and they'd probably get disposed of or disarmed or something like that. Furious, this is where the first of the technicalities comes in, because Furious already has a flight deck. So you could make the argument that as at least partial carrier already, she doesn't count towards the conversion allowance because she already is a carrier. She's just being refitted and upgraded. If you can win that argument, then the full tonnage is available and you could do a pair of G3s. If you couldn't, then you would only be able to do one of them plus Furious within the tonnage that was allowed, or you'd end up having to dispose of or otherwise render inert Furious as well. The second issue when it comes to technicalities is that Lexington, Saratoga, Amagi, as it turned out, Akagi and Kaga, because Amagi was wrecked in the earthquake, and Courageous, Glorious, and Furious were all at various stages of completion. Of course, Courageous, Glorious, and Furious were completed. The other four ships were in a partially complete state, but a fair bit of money had been spent on them. The G3s, on the other hand, had not really been started, so you would be building them essentially from the keel up, which would cost a huge amount of money compared to, from the point of the treaty being signed compared to all the others, which would be a big mark against in the Treasury's book, because obviously they want to try and save money after the First World War. And that's also relevant to the other issue when it comes to the technicality part, which is that by all accounts, some work had been done to lay the keel of at least one of the G3s, because we have the receipts of the Royal Navy paying the shipyard for that work. But even as a maximal level of work, a keel laying would be questionable in terms of arguing that this ship was already under construction, because remember, the clause in the Washington Naval Treaty was for existing tonnage to be converted. Now, if you could successfully argue that, hey, something that at least has at least one keel block laid down technically counts as existing tonnage because the project has started, then you might be able to get away with it. However, realistically, you're essentially then arguing that you get a oversized, because obviously the allowance for conversion from oversized vessels, but you're essentially allowing for the permission to build two oversized ships that, rather than really being conversions, would essentially be designed as carriers from the ground up. You would have to take the G3's drawings and adapt them, obviously, otherwise the whole charade would fall apart very quickly. But a lot of the work that had gone into designing and building the Amagi, Akagi, Kaga, Lexington, Saratoga hulls, etc., which limited their capacity as opposed to purpose-built carriers, that wouldn't be here in this case, because you would essentially be purpose building and purpose designing a carrier that just happened to have some hull similarities with a G3 type battlecruiser. That would give Britain quite an advantage in the 1920s and early 1930s, and I'm not sure that the other two big navies would really want to go for that, so they would almost certainly argue that a keel laying doesn't really count as started tonnage and thus forbid them or argue against the Royal Navy from making those conversions. But if all of those stars align, so you can secure the money, the Royal Navy's fine with disposing of at least Courageous and Glorious, possibly also Furious, and you can somehow twist the arm of the US and Japanese navies to let you essentially build a G3 based purpose-built carrier or two from the ground up, then in theory, yes, you could. But all of those stars aligning is practically going to be impossible, so practically I don't think that's going to happen. There is some argument as well that the G3's design displacement was considerably greater than the Lexington's, or, as it turned out, Akagi, and therefore it would be very, very difficult to get a G3 down to being a carrier that could actually come in at 33,000 tons, even with similar finagling to what they did with Lexington and Saratoga. I'm slightly less persuaded by that argument, mostly on the grounds that a good chunk of that additional weight on the G3s was because the G3s were considerably more heavily armoured than either the Lexingtons or the Amagis, and eventually obviously Kaga. So simply by omitting that armour, or a good chunk of it, you would be saving quite a drastic amount of weight. And of course you have the fact that, as we mentioned, ultimately, if you did get permission to go ahead with it, you'd essentially be building a G3 influenced purpose-built carrier from the ground up, so you'd also be making a lot of weight savings there, as opposed to if you actually had the hull already there and you're having to just rip it out and convert it somewhat. Warrant Officer Will asks, had USS New Orleans and USS Chipawa been completed, would this have possibly resulted in an early attempt at building a proto-Weland canal to give the two first rates access to the sea? Probably not. In fact, I think the US Navy would have been most severely against such an idea. The reason for that is threefold. Firstly, at the end of the War of 1812, one of the treaties that resulted from it was the treaty that held that you were going to disarm the Great Lakes, and that's why HMS St. Lawrence pretty much went by the wayside shortly thereafter. Even if they'd managed to complete New Orleans and Chippewa, if that treaty is still signed, those ships are going to have to be gotten rid of, at which point massive amounts of investment in building a massive canal to allow them to get to the open seas is really not going to be all that attractive. Now, you could argue, of course, that, well, you could disarm the Great Lakes by building said canal to get the ships out of there in order to then, disarm the lakes, and now you have a pair of first rates out on the high seas. Why isn't this a good idea? Well, that comes with two rather large drawbacks other than the massive expense of building said canal. One of them is that all of the Great Lakes first rates, whether that be the Canada and Wolfe, which were under design, the St. Lawrence, which was actually built, and of course New Orleans and Chippewa, they all had compromises in their design to allow them to be built as quickly and as efficiently as possible, mostly around how long an operational range they would have in terms of how many stores could they carry, how much accommodation did they have, and a few tweaks here and there to the way they would handle out on the open water as well, which would mean that they wouldn't really be all that suitable for seagoing, long-range oceanic operations. Potentially, I suppose you could argue that for the US that may not be too much of an issue because, well, historically, even the first rate they did build didn't really go very far. And even if they have fully operational ones, they're most likely going to end up using them for coastal defence, at which point the fact they can't really sail as far as a true first rate probably doesn't make too much odds, but they would still be somewhat limited. But the much, much bigger issue is that if you build said canal and you now have the Great Lakes accessible to the sea via first rates, the problem is, think about who they've just been fighting. The Royal Navy has considerably more ships of the line than the US Navy at this point in time, and for a good length of time thereafter. If you open the Great Lakes to ship of the line access, then that means that in any potential future conflict, instead of there being a localized race for dominance, which the US might be able to win by building up its own shipbuilding capabilities on the Great Lakes, whereas obviously the British have to make use of what, at the time, the Canadian provinces could manage. Instead, the British could just go, yes, here are half a dozen ships of the line. We are going to force our way up into the Great Lakes, and now we dominate them, and good luck. That's a strategic situation the US isn't really going to want to tolerate, and so it would be in their own strategic interests not to advocate for such a canal to be built. Ironically enough, if anyone's going to advocate for it, it might actually have been the British if they'd also been able to build the additional 2 first rates that they had under construction at the time, because letting St. Lawrence go by the wayside was one thing. If they've got 3 fully equipped first-rate ships of the line, even with the short-range issues, they might very well actually want to get them out of there, partly because it will obviously give them the strategic advantage of being able to go back, which obviously, as we said, favours them, but also 3 even short-range ships of the line would actually make quite a useful patrol squadron for the English Channel, or somewhere like that, maybe the Gibraltar Squadron. Mr. Mont asks, thanks for another concise ship history, Drac. As I was listening to the extensive armour requirements for the World War I period, I began to wonder about the all-or-nothing scheme that was cooked up a little bit later. Was there ever a case where the nothing came back to haunt them? When shells hit the nothing part, what sort of things were they hitting, and how often was this a problem in combat? Well, if you're hitting the hull outside of the all-or-nothing armour system, bearing in mind that there would be some armour outside the citadel and places like the steering gear, you would mostly be hitting storerooms and living space, which technically is another kind of storeroom. It's just the cargo tends to run around of its own volition. Rather specifically, battleships didn't tend to keep anything particularly vital or explosive like magazines or engines, boilers, etc. outside the citadel. There would be some fuel storage and stuff like that, but nothing that you couldn't particularly afford to lose in terms of a battle situation. Of course, there would be flooding, which could slow you down, force you to counterflood if there was too much of a list, etc., which wasn't particularly brilliant. And of course, you would settle somewhat in the water, which, if you had lots of hits in the bow, that could be bad, because obviously if you go bow down, then you're going to get water coming green over the top, which could result in even more leakage and potentially could start to restrict the capabilities of your props and your rudder by raising them either close to or almost completely out of the water, and vice versa if you settle by the stern. I mean, settling by the stern is not usually in and of itself quite as bad as settling by the bow, but there are a lot more things in the stern of a ship that you don't necessarily want to have large amounts of water pouring down and around, like, the steering gear and the prop shafts. But when you're looking at battleships specifically, it's actually somewhat difficult to point to specific problems when the nothing part is hit, because if you look at the fast capital ships that were engaged, i.e. the ships that had the all-or-nothing armour scheme, or I suppose, with the US, some of the older standards, almost all of those vessels were never badly hit in combat. Now, yes, you've got the ships that were hit at Pearl Harbor, but the all-or-nothing armour scheme doesn't really have a whole lot to say about torpedo defence. And similarly for Taranto, the Germans didn't do all-or-nothing defence, so Bismarck and Scharnhorst, for example, wouldn't count towards this analysis. Massachusetts was hit, but only a little bit by the French. So really the only case of a capital ship hit by some form of significant fire which resulted in it sinking whilst it had an all-or-nothing armour scheme, which realistically you could potentially point to the all-or-nothing armour scheme being a bit of an issue, might, and I stress the word might, be Prince of Wales, as there is some suggestion that when she took the torpedo hit astern, although it's obviously not a shell hit, as the stern whipped, which of course, as we know, would cause one of the propeller shafts to get all bent out of shape and various glands to rupture, there is some argument to say that the sheer mass of the aft quad turret combined with the citadel just ending right after with a bulkhead and the very thick side armour of the King George V essentially made the stern, the unprotected, mostly, apart from the steering gear, unprotected stern, relatively speaking flexible, and then suddenly there's this very sharp sheer point, which it's somewhat possible that this could have made the whipping of the stern and the damage that resulted from it somewhat worse by making all that energy concentrate in a relatively small area. Whereas in theory, if you had an extended distributed armour scheme, then some of the strengthening of the hull that you naturally get from having the armour plate down the side of it, and the fact the transition from that to the fully armoured section amidships would have been a bit more gradual, might have mitigated the whipping somewhat to start with, and when it did happen, it might have been spread out a little bit more along the ship, which then might have reduced the amount of damage that was done to the ceiling around the propeller shaft and the propeller shaft itself, which in turn might mean that when they restarted the shaft, it might not have gone quite so catastrophically wrong. But you'll notice extensive use of the word might in all of that, because it's a long chain of events with very heavy emphasis on might. So, yeah, there's a marginal case, but more broadly speaking, for the main advantages and disadvantages of the all-or-nothing scheme, all-or-nothing ships really didn't ever come under heavy enough surface-based gunfire for anyone to, I think, really make a value judgment one way or the other based on practical effects rather than theoretical. Shadow Wolf asks, considering HMS Hood's displacement in comparison to contemporary battleships, is it fair to say that she's like Bismarck in that she's an inefficiently designed ship in terms of what you get for her weight? Compared to Warspite, Revenge, and ships of other navies, it seems like Hood has identical or worse firepower and armour while displacing over 10,000 tons more than her contemporaries. Yes, but mostly no. A short version would be to say, well, if you compare the Iowas to their contemporaries, their immediate predecessors, the South Dakotas, you get pretty much the same armour scheme, and you get almost identical firepower, and it costs you about 10,000 tons more. And by comparison, Hood, as you said, costs about 10,000 tons or slightly more than that compared to her contemporaries for similar levels of protection and firepower in exchange for higher speed. And of course, you can then point out that the speed difference from the 27-ish knot previous US fast battleships to the 33-knot Iowas, so about 5 to 6 knots, is actually a smaller gap than the jump from the 21 or 23 knot, maybe 24 if you're looking specifically at the QEs, of contemporary British ships and the original top speed of Hood. So she's actually getting more of a speed boost for about the same tonnage increase. However, there is the fact that you are paying quite a lot of displacement and therefore a lot of money for a ship whose essential performance increase is just about speed. So I think it comes down to how much do you value that speed. But you do have to be careful with comparisons to Bismarck directly, because of course Hood was built with technology 2 decades older, and a good chunk of what you get in terms of that increase in displacement to get her performance is because of the state of engine technology and boiler technology and how much essentially energy per square foot you could generate. If Hood was being built much further down the line, circa contemporary with Bismarck, where you have much better propulsive technology available, and at that point, to be honest, probably an all or nothing armor scheme, you would have gotten a much more efficient ship, i.e. if you're going to have the same displacement, you could have got a lot more out of the ship, or you could have gotten the same performance specs as it had out of a smaller vessel. Indeed, look at Vanguard. She's within and shouting distance of Hood's displacement, and they actually have a basically identical main armament, 8 15-inch 42s, albeit Vanguards are upgraded. But when you look at what Vanguard has in terms of her secondary battery, her anti-aircraft battery, radar, all those other extra systems, plus considerably better armor protection, that's the kind of stuff you get with similar displacement and roughly similar design. I'm not saying they're directly contemporaneous, but they're vaguely in the same ballpark, but with the modern advances in propulsion technology saving you a lot of weight and space. Another problem with this kind of question is that you really want to do comparisons for efficiency as close to like with like as possible. So Hood doesn't actually really have any completed contemporaries to compare for efficiency purposes, because the closest you'd probably get would be the Ersatz Yorks, but they weren't completed, so we don't actually know what their final spec would have been like in terms of actual performance. And of course things like the Lexington and the Amagis were a generation past her. Whereas with Bismarck, we can actually go, okay, Bismarck is a fast capital ship of the late 1930s. Here's a bunch of other fast capital ships of the late 1930s, and you can actually directly compare speed, protection, and firepower and other statistics pretty much directly, which is where you can draw the fact that Bismarck is quite inefficiently designed. And ultimately, I think, at least for me, the way I would rate any kind of efficiency or inefficiency simply comes down to, if you gave the specs, the general specs, speed, protection, firepower, etc., to another nation at the same time, could they have built a ship with identical features and capabilities, at least in broad terms, on a considerably smaller hull? And as I've argued in the past, I think with Bismarck, if you'd given that overall Bismarck spec to Britain or the US or France or Italy or Japan, they could have built a ship equal to Bismarck for less weight, and indeed quite a number of them did. Whereas with Hood, if you gave the specs for Hood in the middle of the 1910s to Germany, Japan, or the US, or France or Italy for that matter, and said, build me this on your own flavour, I don't think any of them would have been able to match Hood at any kind of substantially less displacement. BK Zhong asks, trying to deploy submarines against carriers generally ended in failure due to the speed difference, as the Japanese tended to find out the hard way with their flawed submarine doctrine. So what went into pre-positioning American submarines in the paths of much faster Japanese capital ship forces? There were three main factors that went into this. Firstly was the fact that US submarines, after a short period, could and regularly did operate outside or close to Japanese fleet bases and ports, like Truk or eventually later the Japanese home islands. And this meant it was much, much easier to find Japanese capital ships, like aircraft carriers, because while the Pacific is a very, very, very big place, if you know that they are eventually going to have to come into one port or another, then if you sit it off the relatively much smaller search area that is the offshore waters of that port or atoll or whatever, then eventually something's going to show up. And that's obviously because it's a much smaller search area, it's a much easier area to position yourself to attack, especially if there are some fairly regularly used and known approaches. Secondly, is the fact that there were quite a lot of US submarines, especially by the mid to latter part of the war in the Pacific. So just acting as a matter of statistics, if you are patrolling known Japanese routings, you're going to come across something quite juicy sooner or later. In this, the Japanese and American tactics of we think that the enemy fleet is, or an element of it, is going to be coming along this particular route, let's put out a skirmish line of subs to try and catch it, were, at least to some degree, somewhat similar. But the difference, of course, occasionally the Japanese would get lucky, like with the sinking of Yorktown or Wasp, but the difference, for the most part, came down to the third factor, which was intelligence. Not intelligence of the submarine captains themselves, but intelligence as in the interception and decoding of enemy transmissions, because the Japanese, for the most part, couldn't read the American codes, but outside of changes to coding, which would take a little while to overcome, generally speaking, the Americans could read the Japanese codes, at which point, if you are reading the messages and you know that a given carrier is going from point A to point B, or a force, capital ships, multiple carriers, or whatever, they are going from point A to point B, possibly via point C, and you might also therefore know their sailing times, the day they sail, the time they sail, the day they're expected. From that you can infer their speed, and possibly, depending on the details of the transmission you've intercepted, possibly even some details on specific routing. It's then much, much, much easier to say to your submarines, right, I want you to go to this space at this time, and there should be quite a juicy target that might happen along for you, as opposed to the Japanese side of things, which would be, well, here's roughly the transit corridor from Pearl Harbor to the Western Pacific Theater. We'll put some submarines across here in the hopes that something might show up, because we think something might show up, whereas for the Americans it was, we know that something is going to show up, and also we know pretty much exactly when it's going to show up. A minor factor, of course, was also the relative skill of anti-submarine warfare, because, yes, in theory, the Japanese submarines could camp Pearl Harbor, but American and Allied anti-submarine warfare efforts made submarines camping near Pearl Harbor long-term something of a hazardous proposition, to say the least, whereas the relatively terrible state of Japanese anti-submarine warfare meant that actually patrolling in Japanese home waters towards the latter part of the war, or wandering around near Truk in the mid part of the Pacific campaign, whilst of course it was dangerous, it wasn't anywhere near as dangerous as trying to camp Pearl Harbor would be. Packer 910 asks, is there any record of a hedgehog being fired at a surfaced submarine, and would this have been effective? I don't know if there's any record of somebody looking at a surface submarine and going, you know what we should do? We should fire hedgehog mortars at them. I know there are some instances where hedgehog mortars were fired at a submarine contact, and in between the decision being made to fire and the mortar rounds going through the air, the submarine did surface, but that's slightly different from deliberately deciding to engage an already surfaced target. But in more general terms, no, it wouldn't, or at least shouldn't, have been effective, because hedgehog mortar rounds would only arm themselves after they'd hit the water. Which means that if you fired your hedgehog mortar at a truly surfaced target, as opposed to something that's just at periscope depth, then assuming that everything is actually working as intended, a hedgehog mortar round that goes from the launcher through the air and directly hits the submarine without ever entering the ocean should just bounce off said submarine. Now, of course, with the outer casing and the decking, it might hit and perhaps penetrate through that, but it should then, in theory, clang off of the submarine's pressure hull without doing much more than maybe making a small dent, maybe bashing in some interesting equipment on the outside of the pressure hull. But essentially, it shouldn't explode. If it does explode, then that means the round has actually armed itself before hitting the water, which would mean that it probably was malfunctioning, because then it most likely would have exploded on contact with the water if the submarine hadn't been there, which is not really what you want from an underwater weapon. And of course, the other thing is that even in the event of somehow the thing getting armed in time to strike the pressure hull and explode, it's a smallish charge, and unlike a strike in its intended environment, a strike from a hedgehog mortar in the open air, which does explode, will dissipate most of its explosive force into the open air rather than into the sub, the way it would be if that explosion was bounded by water. And therefore, whilst it might damage the sub, it's not going to have anywhere near the same damaging effect as a direct hit by a hedgehog mortar round while the sub is underwater. Alex Moskovitz asks, in a recent video, Ryan of USS New Jersey listed museum ships that had recently been drydocked, and I noticed that none of them were subs. Can you discuss the differences between drydocking a surface ship versus a submarine, and what that might mean for museum subs? There are a number of differences. For one thing, of course, submarines are considerably smaller than most surface warships that have survived as museum ships. Obviously, when you're talking down on the level of a destroyer escort, then you can start to get into similar levels of displacement. But battleships and cruisers tend to be substantially larger. This, of course, means that submarines can make use of smaller dry docks and should, in theory, cost less to maintain, which is a good thing because, obviously, it costs less generally, and you can find dry docks a lot closer if you don't need a particularly large one. The flip side, of course, is that most submarines in and of themselves don't tend to have the drawing power or the star power or the attraction power, whatever you want to call it, of something like a big battleship. So raising the funds to get the sub into dry dock, even if it costs a lot less than putting a battleship in dry dock, may be harder for some submarines than it would be for larger ships. It just depends on the cost versus income ratio. Now, of course, there is guidance from the US Navy, in the case of US museum ships and subs, on how often these things should be dry docked. But in theory, submarines shouldn't need to be dry docked quite as often. Now, obviously, submarines like destroyers and cruisers and battleships and carriers are still made of steel, and that steel will eventually rust. However, a good number of US submarines are actually in freshwater environments, and even for the ones that are in saltwater or brackish environments, the outer casing and the ballast tanks might be relatively thin, and they might rust through within, the same kind of order of time as destroyers, for example, or the bows of a battleship. However, the core of the submarine, the pressure hull, is going to be made of higher quality and thicker steel than the average hull plating you're going to find on any other preserved warship. For obvious reasons, it's the pressure hull. It has to survive going deep underwater. And thus, the pressure hull is likely to withstand being immersed for a lot longer than a regular warship's hull is. Plus, of course, the pressure hull is usually essentially got an ablative armour layer in the form of the ballast tanks running down the side of the ship, so it's not directly exposed to the wind-water line the way the outer hull of a surface ship would be. Of course, if too many of your ballast tanks do rust through and start to flood, then the submarine will sink. Of course, if the submarine is closed up at the time, that's not necessarily a massive disaster because submarines are designed to sink, as long as you can get it back up to the surface in good order. Of course, if the hatches are open at the time, this could be quite bad. But overall, it's generally a good thing for subs because it means that they don't have to dry dock, at least in engineering terms, quite as often as the surface ships do. With that being said, because of the different points of balance and the metacentric height of submarines versus surface ships, when they're in dry dock, they do require slightly different forms of support compared to surface ships. Most surface ships you can just use keel blocks, and they'll quite happily sit on those keel blocks and not really move one way or another. If you put a submarine only on keel blocks, usually you might get away with it, but there is a non-zero chance that significantly changing the loading on the sub by moving equipment around, adding equipment to it, etc., or a very strong wind, or even a small earth tremor could cause the poor old sub to fall off its blocks, which is bad. And this actually has happened in the past, not necessarily with museum subs, but with submarines that were in dry docks in, say, the Second World War. So you do have to be a little bit more ambitious when it comes to propping your sub up in dry dock. The other big limitation, of course, is that whilst you can work on the exterior of a submarine or the exterior of a surface vessel relatively easily, as you would have seen from the Guide to Silversides, there is stuff you might want to work on a sub that's outside of the pressure hull but inside of the outer hull casing, which can be somewhat more difficult to access. And of course, any work you want to do inside the sub has to be done using equipment you can fit through the hatches, which is a substantially greater restriction than it is for getting equipment into your average surface ship. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, despite being completely banned from having them by the Treaty of Versailles, German naval development in regards to submarine technology seems to be almost completely unaffected during the interwar period, in stark contrast to their knowledge of how to design surface warships, which seemed to almost regress despite still being allowed to build and operate surface ships. Why was this? Partially, it was because whilst the Germans were allowed to build surface warships, the Versailles limitations, at least as long as they chose to follow them, severely restricted what they could build. So yes, they could build something with big guns, but it was limited to 10,000 tons. They could build cruisers, but they were limited to significantly less displacement than everybody else. So essentially you had treaty cruiser tonnage, but being applied for the Germans to their capital ships, and almost, not quite, but almost half that being applied to their cruisers, and so on and so forth. And so what they had experience of designing was quite small, lightweight vessels, which didn't really bode well when they tried to design something that was going to be competitive with actual treaty-compliant vessels. You know, if you've got no experience designing a 10,000-ton cruiser, chances are you're going to end up with something like the Admiral Hippers if you're trying to match a 10,000-ton cruiser, but without the experience of how to trim all those weights. And similarly with something like Bismarck, when you try and match treaty-era battleships in a period where the only capital ship you've designed that's actually really worthy of being called a capital ship is the Scharnhorst, and that was relatively recently after a decade and a half of a gap. Whereas for submarines, the short version is that the Germans never stopped developing submarines. While there were big gaps in their development of full-scale warships, Krupp essentially set up an out-of-Germany office in the Netherlands, and they spent the interwar period quite happily designing submarines for the Netherlands, for the Finns, for various other countries. And so, because there were lots of other countries that were interested in submarines, you could have this office, which officially wasn't linked back to Germany, in the Netherlands, quite happily designing submarines and staying current with all the latest advances in tech. Because, hey, well, you know, if Germany can't build submarines anymore, but there's a bunch of German submarine designers, well, they want to continue their career. Well, if they go and work in a foreign country and they're building submarines for a country that isn't Germany, then, well, we're kind of just about on the right side of playing by the rules. The fact that when Germany decides they want to have submarines again, all those designers promptly just go back to Germany, and Germany now has cutting-edge submarines being constructed, well, that's just a happy accident, of course. Conversely, the market for independently built heavy cruisers and battleships had unfortunately dried up after the First World War, so they couldn't really set up an out-of-Germany office for that. Hans Lasser asks, why transport bricks from the Netherlands to Batavia? And was there an international trade in stolen maps and charts? These documents were surely considered precious and probably secret. The reason for the brick and, in other places, marble trade, both from Europe to Batavia, but also Europe to what would later become the USA and so forth, was essentially, actually, surprisingly, making bricks or cut stone for building European-style houses and warehouses and so forth is actually quite an energy and labour-intensive process. You either have to have a stone quarry of suitable quality stone, which you might not physically have in the area, and even if you do, mining operations require quite large contingents of labour. Then you've got to transport the stones, you've got to have stonemasons to dress the stones, and then you've got to have a lot of labour to put them all together at the end of it. And if you're a small European outpost in some far-flung corner of the world, as it was at the time, you physically probably don't have that many people, even if the resources are available. And with bricks, well, you've got to find a decent source of clay. And again, it's quite labour-intensive. You've got to open a clay mine, or whatever other material, usually clay, that you'd be using to make the bricks. You've got to get a fairly large-scale production of lumber or coal going, so either cutting down lots of trees or starting a coal mine or something like that to fire your kilns. And then you've got to have a whole brick production centre. And again, you probably don't have the time, the labour, or possibly the resources nearby in order to do any of that. At which point, you might as well just get someone that does have all those facilities already set up and is producing large quantities of them, like, say, back in Europe. And, well, a ship needs ballast, so you put the bricks or the dressed stone in as ballast for the ship. The ship now can carry cargo on top of that, and hey, that ship can then sell those bricks at the other end, and the whole thing is about trade, so, well, people will have money, even if they don't have time and labour and other resources, so they can buy the bricks off of you. They then have pre-made bricks or stonework, which they can build their houses with, and then the ship can find some other heavy object to go down instead of the ballast, so it can carry even more valuable stuff back home, so it's a win-win for everybody. As far as maps and charts go, not so much an international trade. There might be a few international sort of dealings, but generally, yes, maps and charts in that time period were incredibly precious, and quite a few of them were secret, which meant that, if possible, much like secret code equipment and so forth in World War I and World War II, if a ship was going to be captured, very often they would try and destroy or hide the maps and charts. But if they were eventually seized, well, because they were so valuable, if somebody seized them and their country didn't already have those charts, then they would just keep them. So if a Royal Navy frigate, for example, seized a French frigate or a Spanish frigate, and those ships happened to have charts of French or Spanish ports aboard, and the Admiralty hadn't made their own charts of that area, or the capture charts were of better quality, then those charts would go back to the Admiralty would reproduce them for the British, but it would then stay with the British, because now it's their secret, rather than selling it on to anyone else. Unless, of course, you happen to have a bunch of allies, in which case you might sell them some selected charts to help them, know where to attack and so forth. But the only time you'd really get an international trade in stolen maps and charts would be if some independent third-party actor somehow got hold of them. Let's say in the case of a true pirate, because a privateer, of course, is licensed by a specific state. So if they did capture valuable maps and charts from an enemy, then they would, near enough as makes no difference, make sure that those got into the hands of their sponsor country. But a true pirate, or perhaps a small country that has no particular interest in attacking a specific kind of colony but is generally at war with somebody, they might look to sell those charts or possibly gift them to someone in exchange for some other advantage or compensation. So, a pirate, let's say, who captures a British merchant ship that happens to be carrying a detailed chart of the approaches to, the UK's west coast, if they're a true pirate, they might then look to try and sell those on at the nearest French port, assuming that the French won't just generally hang them for piracy anyway. But, if you can make a cover story that you're some kind of regular merchant, or the French just don't care, or they like you, then you could try and sell the charts to them. Or, for example, when you've got the big alliances going on in the Napoleonic Wars, if, let's say, a Neapolitan ship, that's from one of the various states that would later make up Italy, if they capture, again, a French or Spanish vessel that has some detailed charts, they, in and of themselves, let's say the charts have come off of a ship that's just been over in the Caribbean, and there are a bunch of Caribbean colonies, well, the Neapolitans have no particular interest in sending their small fleet halfway across the planet to attack small islands in the Caribbean, but their British allies do. So that's where sort of trading, that either selling them or gifting them in exchange for some other compensation, might come into play. Graham William Kidd asks, the South African Navy. We hear about Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but not much about South Africa. Why, and what was their Navy's story in both World Wars? Well, in World War I, the short answer is it just flat out didn't exist, and therefore you can't tell a story about a Navy that didn't exist. There was a South African contingent of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, which had a few hundred people in it, but no dedicated ships. So that's pretty much it for the First World War. However, in the interwar period, there then did become a South African Navy, initially the South African Naval Service, and later on named the Seaward Defence Force. But essentially you might as well refer to them as the Royal South African Navy or the South African Navy of the time. But this was fairly small, for one thing. They had a few trawlers and a training ship and that kind of stuff. But also, if you think about positioning, South Africa was not immune to the effects of World War II. U-boats did prowl around and sink ships off its coast. But compared to the Canadians, who were pretty much on the front line for the Atlantic, and Australia and New Zealand, who initially weren't on the front lines, but then very much were on the front lines when it came to Japan, South Africa was a bit removed from everything. And between that and having a smaller population and economy, they just, again, still didn't have a very large naval force. It did expand quite significantly in the Second World War, but mostly using converted craft for minesweeping duties and general small-scale anti-submarine work. And, well, minesweeping and anti-submarine work on the South African coast and then later up and down the East and West African coasts, unfortunately just isn't as exciting as, the story of full-scale warships with HMCS or HMAS prefixing them, or HMNZS, going into frontline action. Towards the mid to latter stages of the war, you did have some South African ships, again, mostly on convoy-related work, starting to creep into the Mediterranean, and right towards the end of the war, they finally got some warships, albeit they were fairly small frigates. But essentially, the story of the South African Navy in World War II is one of small ships operating quite far from the major theatres of war, as we said, with the exception of the Mediterranean, and generally operating in the smaller ships, which are usually more of the unsung heroes generally, regardless of which particular flag they're flying. And thus, that's why we don't hear too much about them, but that is roughly what they were getting on with. Patrick Donnelly asks, in the period covered by this channel, what tactical or strategic decisions were based on, or approximately based on, spite? Well, if the reports of the reason for the explosion aboard it are true, then the loss of the San Salvador during the Armada campaign would be the result of spite. Specifically, if you recall, you can see it here in this picture, down in the sort of the bottom centre left, that ostensibly what happened was the Spanish officers were being particularly tyrannical to the gunners, who were independent contractors, and after several loud exchanges and potentially physical assaults going on between a Spanish officer and a German gunner, the gunner ostensibly just said, screw this for a game of soldiers, chucked a burning torch or slow match into an open barrel of gunpowder nearby and leapt off the ship, the explosion touching off a rather large explosion, which then left the hulk of the San Salvador drifting to be captured by the English. But although there were potentially a number of tactical and strategic decisions made on spite, funnily enough, a good chunk of the ones that we can at least mostly attest to seem to be spite against other people in the same naval service. There obviously are instances of spite against an opposition navy. The early kamikaze attacks, before kamikaze attacks were officially a thing, could potentially be seen as that, and they happened on both sides. If your aircraft's going down in flames and you don't think there's any real chance of you surviving, well, you can just accept your fate and go with it, or with your last breath you can try and take a bunch of the enemy with you. That's technically a form of spite, and as I say, both sides exercised in that on occasion in the time preceding actual full-on legitimate, as in, formally encouraged kamikaze missions. But a lot more of it was a case of interpersonal rivalry and people just not cooperating or doing something deliberately contrary because they didn't like their commander. So you've got, for example, John Paul Jones being fired on by his own squadron the minute the free fire situation developed. But equally, there are a number of battles where the Royal Navy was involved, particularly in the early and somewhat mid part of the 1700s, where battles were potentially either lost or went down to the wire or were a draw because an admiral would order an attack and in they went, and other lower ranking admirals would go, yeah, but I don't like you, so I'm just going to stay here, or very slowly comply with orders, at which point only a portion of the fleet is engaged, the bit that you don't like, and then everything goes to pieces. And, that's not necessarily something that was exclusive to the 18th century. Look at the Battle of Lissa, for example, and the interpersonal problems between the Italian fleet senior officers. Nathaprong Hongcheron asks, Francesco Caracciolo's 15-inch 40 caliber gun mounts were about the same weight as the 1929 Deutschland's triple 11-inch mounts. If we ignore minor difficulties like the hull potentially failing under the recoil of a 15-inch gun, or Krupp's slide breeches not fitting in a turret that small, and the fact that other countries wouldn't be happy with 15-inch armed ships, would it even make sense for Panzerschiffe to maybe instead have been a slower version of large light cruisers instead of the way they were historically armed? And if not, what problem needed to exist for them for that idea to be a good solution? Well, if we ignore Krupp's insistence on the sliding breech block and assume that they grew a brainstem and had interrupted screw breeches developed for their larger calibers of guns, the single biggest stumbling blocks would be, at the time the Deutschlands were designed, the Reichsmarine, as it was at that point, was making a legitimate effort to stick to the Treaty of Versailles requirements, which limited them to 11-inch guns. So for the Panzerschiffe to be built with 15-inch guns would require either for the Weimar Republic to decide to tear up the Versailles Treaty, which probably wouldn't end well for them, or for the Panzerschiffe to be built later on, once the Nazi government had decided actually they weren't going to either pay attention to the Versailles restrictions or try and not antagonize Britain, which is why the Scharnhorst had 11-inch guns. So if we assume that the political situation is out of the way, the other problems are, well, the structural in terms of recoil. So a ship that size, well, obviously you can make a ship that size or smaller cope with a 15-inch gun blast. Just look at the Erebus and Terror, the monitors. But if you want it on a relatively fine hull form that's going to move at any significant speed, that's going to add more weight than just the weight of the gun mount and turret to the equation. And the other major issue I can see someone slapping down almost immediately for the kind of ship that the Deutschlands were supposed to be is, apart from perhaps limited ammunition storage, which is quite an important issue for a commerce raider, would be the fact that if you go with a pair of twin 15-inch mounts, you have 4 guns. With 2 triples, you can either get a 6-gun broadside off, so 6 shells versus 4, you've added 2 additional chances to hit for any given salvo, but also when it comes to ranging, bearing in mind this is the interwar period where you don't have radar-assisted range finding and so forth, if you're going to do a series of ranging salvos, whilst a 3-gun salvo is not necessarily the best, as we've mentioned before, ideally you want a 4-gun salvo, you could, in theory, still do alternating ladders using your fore and after turrets with triple mountings and still get some reasonable data and lock in your range relatively quickly that way. And of course, if you're forced to engage multiple targets with your separate gun batteries like Graf Spee had to, and then again, you've got just enough shells to get some level of reasonable data for your salvo corrections. Whereas if you're just doing 2 guns, that's not going to be possible. The only way you're going to get reasonable salvo data is from firing both turrets, which means a 4-gun salvo, which means not only have you now halved your rate of theoretically collecting data, but also you've limited absolutely your ability to collect decent data based on fall of shot to broadside engagements only, which for a ship that might potentially have to fight off multiple cruisers from multiple angles is not a brilliant plan. For that kind of thing to be practical, you would have to go down the design of the Panzerschiffe being more along the other line of thinking, which they didn't take up, which would be more of a coastal defense vessel, more along the vein of the Sverriers, rather than a long-distance commerce raider, which is what they kind of went with. Nathan P. Gillespie asks, do we have any idea when sailors started being buried at sea? Not precisely, because the practice of burial at sea initially would have been a bit more of an ad hoc matter depending on the civilization and depending on what kind of voyage you were conducting. Because if you're looking in the very early history of seafaring, for example, Phoenician, Assyrian, Egyptian, Greco-Roman, for a large extent, if you are mostly traveling within sight of the coast, or if you're transiting into open water completely, you're maybe only a few days away from landfall at any given time, then if somebody dies aboard the ship, you would just bury them on land, because, well, they're only going to be dead a few hours, usually, outside of big battle conditions, and even if it's a day or 2, then you might wrap them up in a shroud or something like that and put them to one side, and then follow whatever your culture's burial practices are ashore. However, once you start conducting voyages where there's a potential of somebody dying aboard and you might be 3, 4, 5 or more days away from shore, now you have a problem, because you will start to have that body rot in a serious way. That is going to be a major health hazard, apart from the smell. And so then, partly as a matter of practicality and partly also to potentially appease whichever sea god struck him down, in your view at the time, bearing in mind we're still talking about the ancient world, then you might conclude that perhaps a burial at sea is the best thing for everybody. But then, of course, as the fortunes of seafarers wax and wane, and shipping largely reverts back to coastal trade, the need disappears, but then shipping goes out on long-distance voyages again, and then the need appears again, and so on and so forth. And again, it would still remain to a certain extent somewhat conditional on where your ship was. So, for example, let's say during the 18th century, now you have ships that are at sea for weeks or months at a time. If somebody dies in the mid-Atlantic and you're 2, 3, 4 weeks away from landfall, you're definitely burying them at sea. But if somebody falls out of a mast and dies 6 hours before you're due to make landfall, you'll probably keep them around for a burial on land at that point. So essentially it tracks with people being more than a day or 2 away from land, whenever that happens to be in history, and as I said, it comes and goes a little bit before it really sets in. The Rogue Chief asks, when collecting injury pay for his eye and arm, Nelson quipped that next time he'd be collecting for a leg as well. But exactly how much more of him would have to go missing before the Navy just retired him? Well, back then there weren't really strict regulations about such things in the way that there would be later on, like, say, circa Battle of Tsushima, where there were specific regulations in the Japanese Navy about how many fingers you could lose before you were retired. Instead, it was essentially a case of what is the utility of this man versus how effectively can he carry out his duty. So, for example, a able seaman, or more especially a topman, someone who works a lot up in the sails, if they lost a limb, honestly, that's pretty much their career toast. whereas obviously Nelson lost a limb and was able to continue. Conversely, if you were working somewhat lower down in the ship, perhaps you're just sitting around in the magazines all day, keeping an eye on the gunpowder and making sure it was all put into relevant charges, then losing major body parts in a previous element of your career might not be a career ender, because as long as you can sit in a chair and ladle gunpowder around, well, that's all you need to do. So Nelson, being an admiral, has a little bit more latitude on what bits of him he can lose, because what's very valuable to the Royal Navy is, of course, his mind, and therefore his ability to command ships and guide fleets in battle. And honestly, losing your head to a cannonball tends to terminate your naval service rather quickly. The rest of you is almost superfluous to that. So essentially it would be a case of not necessarily how many bits of him he can lose, but which bits of him he can lose. With one arm, he can still board a ship, walk around a ship, fight if necessary with his other arm. He's still got an eye, so he can still see what's going on, roughly speaking. So, losing an ear, for example, not a massive problem. Even receiving a major head injury beyond losing an eye, the way that Captain Broke did, not necessarily a problem once recovery has gone on, assuming that the recovery hasn't affected his faculties. Potentially even losing part of a leg might not be a game ender, but once you start losing bits of your legs, that is probably beginning to push it, because that would affect his ability to get aboard and off of a ship. They might be able to overlook that to a certain degree. You can, of course, just get a wooden leg and clomp around on that and perhaps be hoisted on and off a ship. But if you start losing, as an admiral, so many limbs that you can't write orders or meaningfully navigate around your ship, and that'll start to affect morale of the crew apart from anything else, that would be roughly when they'd go, okay, yeah, you're probably best off retired at this point, assuming that your military genius was enough to otherwise justify you being around. If you were more rank and file admiral, then someone deciding to retire after the loss of an eye and an arm would be a bit more understandable. Whereas, with Nelson, I think pretty much they would have kept him around as long as he wanted to be around and was still vaguely coherent. And finally, Vokir asks, for the nations that either partially or totally missed the first generation of dreadnoughts by being a little slow off the mark, would any of them have been better off centering their forces around battlecruisers rather than battleships? Ganget, Conte de Cavour, Corbeil, Tegethoff, and the majority of the South American dreadnoughts were all ordered years after the launch of Invincible and Von der Tann, albeit sometime before their commissioning. I think making that judgment call on a nation-by-nation basis depends largely on two factors. Firstly, who are the likely opposition? So for the Russians, they have to think about the Germans and what the Ottomans are trying to get hold of. For the Italians, they're thinking primarily about the Austro-Hungarians, even though they're notionally allied with them. For the French, they're thinking partially about the Italians, partially about the Germans. The Austro-Hungarians are thinking primarily about the Italians, and the South American countries are all thinking about each other. So what is your opposition doing? Step one. Because if your opposition, for example, is going with the slightly thinner protected battleship, for example, if Argentina or Chile are looking at Brazil and going, the Minas Gerais class, they only have a 9-inch belt, or perhaps the Austro-Hungarians looking at the Italians and going, the last few Italian pre-dreadnoughts have been looking more at speed than armour, then a battlecruiser might start to make more sense, because the speed gives you a tactical advantage. The firepower, even if it's reduced compared to a battleship, should still be sufficient against a relatively lightly protected enemy battleship. And if you can, punch holes in the enemy battleship at range and you've got speed, then perhaps having slightly less armour yourself won't make too much odds, because in theory then you're roughly equal in armour. Firepower, if you go for heavier guns, might actually be equal or close to. You might even have an advantage if you go with 13.5 or 14-inch guns. And of course you have the speed advantage. But of course, if you're thinking about maybe going up against the Germans in rather confined environments like the Baltic, then you probably want to stick with battleships. The other factor is precisely when. Because if you're looking at, say, an Invincible or even to a certain degree a Von der Tann as your model, well, assuming that your opponent either is going to buy more battleships or perhaps is still buying a relatively capable battleship, let's say, for example, you're Chile looking at the Rivadavias, then maybe you don't necessarily want to go with the battlecruiser approach. Whereas, if you wind the clock forward a few years and suddenly you're looking at, say, the British starting to build the Lion class, which now has a maximum belt armor thickness similar to some of the earlier dreadnoughts, particularly, for example, the Minas Gerais or Agincourt, depending on which iteration of name Agincourt is on at that point. It hasn't become Agincourt yet. Or indeed, at that point, the Germans building ships like Seydlitz and Moltke and maybe even starting to think about Der Flinger. Well, now you could potentially get a battlecruiser that has respectable armor generally, and perhaps even very respectable armor compared to your opponent's battleships. And you've got the speed advantage, and potentially, if you're looking down more like the British model with the 30.5-inch guns, a potential firepower advantage. And so as time goes forward, and perhaps your more likely opponents have adopted the earlier forms of dreadnoughts with some design compromises or sacrifices built in, then maybe a battlecruiser instead of a battleship begins to look a little bit more attractive, assuming, of course, that you can afford it. And that's it for this episode of the Drydock, folks. Just a quick reminder that just over a week's time from now, I will be heading out to the United States. So if you want to come and say hi, I'll be at USS Cod. I'll be at USS Slater, both in the northeast of the US. And I think there might still be time just about to register for the USNI conference at Annapolis, although you'll probably be pushing the margins a little bit at this point. And then I'll obviously also be in San Diego for the Historical Naval Ships Association conference, but meetups at that point will have to be on a bit of a more ad hoc basis. But other than that, I hope to see a bunch of you there. I know a lot of you have already said you're going to be around at one or the other event. And with that said, thanks very much. See you again in another video.